hopefully apply some critical thinking of what you're writing. Now, I think one of the things that I really want to stress is that in the same way that you would never sit down and imagine that you could write a novel from start to finish in one sitting. When you do scientific writing, you're not going to write a report or a document or a paper or whatever from start to finish just by sitting down. It really, a lot of it is thinking about how you're going to tackle the different components of it, and then essentially being able to work and rework, edit. Editing is incredibly important, but the only way you get to editing is actually to do the writing first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. Any questions so far, by the way? I think he's fairly general. Okay.
Can I just jump in? I forgot to say at the start, we're recording this, so people who didn't make it can watch it. So just to be aware.
Oh yeah, sure. Totally fine with that. Except I hate hearing myself recorded, but that's fine. I don't have to hear myself.
You don't have to rewatch it. You don't.
Exactly. So I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. Make sure I share the right one. I've been also teaching, and I'm forever petrified that I'm actually going to share some sort of like important document that's not for wider circulation. Okay, so hopefully you guys should see a keynote, and I'm going to push play, and hopefully this won't crash the session. Okay, so hopefully everybody sees a slide, and it says writing strategies for scientists, and it's just white, and then it has my name on there. Okay, so okay, I haven't heard anything otherwise, so I assume everything is good to go. Okay, so before I start, writing is hard. I just want to say that again. Writing is hard. I know you think physics is hard. I know you think doing derivations and homework sets and coding is hard. Yeah, all those things are hard. Writing is also hard. And the thing with writing is that it's something that we often kind of put to the side because it is hard, because it's not something that most of us necessarily enjoy, but it's primarily because most of us maybe don't feel as confident in it as you would as, say, setting up a lab experiment, or setting, or making some measurements, or deriving a theoretical expression. Those are all things you're very comfortable with because that's what you're trained to do. Writing, the assumption is, well, you learned how to do it in grade school, so you should be able to do it now. But in the same way that you presumably learned maths in grade school, I'm guessing that the maths that you did in grade school is not the maths that you do now. And so writing is along the same way, is that you have the basics for it that you have developed in grade school, but now you actually have to also develop that next level of mastery. And it's hard because it's not something that it really is something that you only get better at first by reading things that are well written, but then also writing. And this is just writing, about 10,000 hours. And so what happens a lot of time is that if you have to write something like a lab report or a document, or maybe start writing up certain chapters for an honors thesis or whatever, you're going to choose to do other things. You're going to choose to do the data analysis. You're going to choose to make plots. You're going to choose to read papers, which means you really are avoiding stuff because nobody really likes reading papers for a very long period of time, right? And so what I'm trying to introduce to you is this idea of something that's urgent and important. And so this is something that I always talk about in terms of time management, which is that we do, there's these two axes of things that are urgent and things that aren't important. And so these are the types of things that go into those 4 quadrants. Interruptions, right? So drop-in visitors, that doesn't happen very much these days, but I don't know, maybe if you're living with friends and you guys are in lockdown together, somebody wants to come in and just hang out for a little while, or phone or email, Facebook, that's a big one, right? Scrolling through the news, because basically you think, oh, I'm just going to check the news, and then half an hour later you're still reading the news, right? Then there are things that are also urgent but and important. So maybe you have a deadline that your supervisor just said, hey, I really need you to make this figure by tomorrow because we have to submit it as part of this proposal. Okay, so and this proposal is going to fund you for the next 3 years, right? So that's urgent and important, that you're like, okay, I got to do that. Then there's the stuff that's not urgent, but it's actually really important. So that's planning, research, design, creativity. Creativity is really important for science and physics in general. It's not just rote, it really is how do you think creatively about problem solving. And so the writing, for the most part, where does it go? Well, what we tend to do as people is we tend to do the stuff that's urgent. And so that could include things that are not important as well as important things. This is where the procrastination area is, right? Calling a friend. Well, I mean, it's good to keep in touch with your friends. I do think it's really important to have, a social support system and hobbies and things other than just your research and your schoolwork and your academics. But not necessarily, you don't need to binge watch that entire first 3 seasons of that show, right? That's maybe you do as a reward, but this is where the writing goes. It doesn't seem urgent, but it's really important, especially if you're trying to get a thesis. So either an honors thesis or master's or PhD. Essentially my summary is that same with lab work. If you're writing up reports for your lab, none of it exists until you actually submit it as a written document. It doesn't matter how amazing it was. It doesn't matter how good the measurements were. It doesn't matter how impressive the caliber or the quality of the data are. If you don't write it up, it doesn't exist. It might as well have never happened. And so it's really important to think about, well, I do the science, I do the research, but it's not just the analytical part, it's also the writing that's really important. So in general, as you go through your professional careers, and well, more broadly in life, I would say, it's really important to think about the things that are important. That's actually critical. And not just do the things that you feel are urgent, the things that you're like, oh, well, I have to do this, I have to do this. Especially now because we're in this endless news cycle and everything that's going on with the pandemic, which I hope everyone's, for the most part, staying healthy and well and not affected too much by the world. I really think about what it is that's important and do that, even if it doesn't feel urgent, because in the end, you really want to be focusing your time on things that are important. Okay, so when you're writing, in this case, let's think about either a lab report or documentation or a paper. I think most of us from when we were in school were that, okay, well, I'm going to read a book or I'm going to read a series of essays and then I'm going to write my report on it, usually the night before, right? Science doesn't work this way. So science really happens while you're writing. So if you have a project that spans the term, you should already be looking at the literature and writing up the literature component of it. You should already be thinking about the key plots that go into whatever that report is or that document or the paper is. And then to sort of break it up into essentially what I consider a storyboard. And those things will move around. Those little bits and pieces will move around. But then at least you have a framework for where you're starting to where you need to go. Does that make sense does anyone have any questions about that? Okay, I'm just gonna ask and just shout out, how many of you guys written reports or something along the lines of something that's more than, say, a 5-page document for scientific consumption? Yeah, okay. And so is this similar to what your experience was, or just out of curiosity?
Yeah, kind of, I'd say. Like, it is pretty similar. Like, you kind of get the map in your head and then you start working on it, and it's pretty, I'd say there's a lot to put in when you're thinking about how it goes, because then the story, you kind of having the idea that this story, you should have an ending to it, like how you want to, how you want to know how it starts and what you want in it. But what I've realized is as you go down through the entire story process, it kind of changes as well. Because then you realize I could add something else, and then you can weave that in, and yeah, it's pretty. You learn a lot like as you do it as well. So
exactly, and that's what I really want to emphasize is that to be able to process the information of whatever research project you're on, whether or not it's for a class or if it's actually for independent research, writing it up really causes you to reflect on what you're doing, and also look at it in a more objective way of identifying the strengths and the weaknesses of your scientific arguments and where you need to maybe do a little bit more work, either in terms of extra measurements, fine-tuning the parameters, obtaining data from another group that's already published their data for comparison. You don't know any of these things until you actually start putting together your document, until you start putting together the figures, and until you start actually writing what you're doing. And just remember that everything you write doesn't necessarily go into the final product in the same way that I'm sure that many of you guys, if you've ever set up an experiment in a lab, yeah, it takes a lot of time, and not all of those will be, the setup will go well, or yeah, or if any of you guys have ever, my analogy is either a musical instrument or athleticism. You don't just pick up the violin one day and start playing at a concert level, right? You spend 10,000 hours practicing and practicing and practicing, but nobody sees the 10,000 hours. They just see that, the performance of maybe an hour. But you can't get to that last hour until you've actually done those 10,000 hours of rehearsal and learning, etc. And so same thing with writing. You can write, and a lot of the stuff you write won't necessarily go into the final document, but it's there as a way of you practicing how to express your very, very complicated and technical thoughts in a clear and concise way. So don't be precious about the writing, just write. And then once you actually have material, then you can go back and edit, move things around, imagine where that storyboard is. But if you think, well, okay, I need to make sure I have all my measurements or have all my derivation done, and then I start writing, then you've actually delayed something that's going to change anyway. So you might as well get started right from the very beginning. In fact, I have my students pretty much, if you're doing research with me, hire, like basically planning on writing a paper with me, I have them start writing from the first day. I say, well, if you're doing a literature review, you should at least be writing up the stuff that people have been doing, or at least summarizing what people have been doing. Oops. Okay. So how do you actually tackle writing? I think that depending on what your time scales are, you really should have dedicated writing sessions. Don't think that you can just sit down and basically whip something out in half an hour. It's going to take, depending on how complicated something is, especially for a paper or a chapter or a lab report, it will take more than just an hour the night before. Really try to set an achievable goal. For example, I'm now going to write the discussion section. I'm now going to write the introduction. I'm going to now write the conclusions. I'm going to write the abstract. So so really, before you sit down, just try to think, okay, this is my goal. This is what I'm going to do during this session. So you should really write only. So once again, no other interruptions, no internet, no email, right? So those are the urgent, not important stuff. And then just write. And then if you don't get exactly what you wanted, that's okay. It's still better than nothing. And it's probably, because we're all A-type overachieving people, it was probably not particularly realistic, whatever it was your goal was in the first place. It was probably overly ambitious. And just also in general, just kind of keep a good sense of humor about writing. Sometimes writing goes well. That's not very often. A lot of times it's just, you just gotta keep going and it'll get there, and just put out the material. One of my former students, she got her PhD like last year. She has the best quote, which is, A lot of bad writing needs to happen before you get to the good writing. So it's best to start writing as soon as possible to get all the bad writing out of the way so you can get to the good writing. And it's very, very true. And so if you think, well, if I just wait long enough, I'll have thought about it enough that I'll be good at it. And so once again, I'm just going to go to my analogy is I can sit here and think about, well, how am I going to practice that violin, and just sit here and think about it for a really, really long time. And I can guarantee you that when I pick it up, I will not be a very good violin player. But if I'd spent that time actually practicing it, I would be definitely better. In terms of strategies, write a paper. Like I said, don't plan on sitting down and just writing it from start to finish. And this, I know I have the word paper here, but this is also true for any sort of live report or documentation, proposals, etc. These things take time, and you're going to attack them in different ways and at different components. And everybody has a different approach. Some people like more to work on figures first, so that you can kind of get the idea of a storyboard. I had one student who basically, he tried that and he hated it. And he said, what he does is he writes the introduction first. Because what that means is that in his head, he knows why, his motivation for doing what he's doing and what the motivation for the paper is. And so with that starting point, he was able to then really go forward on that. And so everybody has a different technique. You just got to try different things and see what works for you. So for example, as I said, sometimes some people tackle the hardest sections first. Some people prefer to maybe have the overview first. But whatever it is that your approach is, just try different things. And if it doesn't work, that's okay. Try something else. Something else will work for you. All of us are different, and we have different approaches to how we. And the most important thing is, I think someone mentioned it earlier about like how they started writing this paper, and in the end, it wasn't exactly what they had expected at the beginning. But in the end, you know, I may not have gone where I intended to go, but I think I've ended up where I needed to be. And that's the case for any sort of report or paper or document, etc. Now, especially since you guys are all younger than me, I suspect that most people, because I have a very hard time focusing, and I suspect that you do sometimes as well, is that, and when I mean focusing, I mean like really focusing. All of our brains need concentrated periods of time to make progress on tasks. So if you decide to go check your messages, you step away from whatever you're doing. Believe it or not, there have actually been studies showing that this basically means you've lost your focus for anywhere up to half an hour. And so it really does help if you're going to have to do some very intensive thought, because writing at a scientific level really is high level thinking. And so you really want to try to help yourself as much as possible. So try and remove distractions, and do the writing when your brain works best. So for me, I write better in the morning. So basically, if I block out writing times before lunchtime, and then after lunchtime, that's when I schedule all my meetings and my discussions. I mean, these are all things that I am still very engaged in, but at least for the part of my brain that I need for the writing, that part is just done after lunch. I've met people who are exactly the opposite. They're basically like, I can only start usually after my afternoon coffee, and I'm like, I can barely stay awake at that point. But so you need to figure out when your brain is most alert and really identify that as a time for writing. And there's some other focus techniques as well. Turning off your phones, turning off your email, closing your browser, closing off any notifications, unless of course it's an emergency. If you are in a space where you can shut your door, either to, or even a cubicle, and really try to isolate yourself that way, then do that. Or the library is also a really good place for writing because it's quiet. And so even if it's nice sometimes to be around other people, but you don't want them to disturb you. So that could be a good place as well. If people are still allowed to go on campus. I know some people who go into cafes at work. I find cafes to actually be too loud, and I find it super distracting, but maybe if that works for you, that's great. But the most important thing, as I said, is that you really, really want to remove all your distractions. Oops. So this technique I use, and I know other people who do this as well, because sometimes you're like, right, you're like, oh, I'm gonna sit down and write now for 2 or 3 hours. Oh, I don't want to do this. This is terrible. I'm gonna do something else, like basically clean my kitchen or, do all my laundry, right? So that's usually a bad sign, is that when you start doing all the chores that you don't like to do necessarily to avoid writing. But one way you can try to trick your brain into doing this is to, well, look, okay, I'm only gonna do this for 25 minutes. I'll set a timer. You can use your phone for this or your watch or whatever. And then during these 25 minutes, I'm going to write a paragraph or write the figure caption or write the abstract or describe my research, my lab experiment. And then you set the timer. And that sense that, okay, I only have 25 minutes to do this really helps you focus. And then after that, you get to take a 5-minute break. And it allows your brain to focus because there's a sense of urgency. But then you also get to reward yourself because, first of all, after those 25 minutes, you will have done something. Trust me, you will. And then you get to take a break, a 5-minute break. And then just doing this a couple of times really helps restart your brain. Because as I said, writing is a very, very high level process, and it takes a lot of energy and a lot of focus. So whatever it is that you can do to help with that, really, really can be very powerful. So this is called the Pomodoro Technique, just because the person who invented it has nothing to do with tomatoes. It's just us. Does anyone have any questions so far? Or can anyone share like a challenge that they find with writing? I'm quite happy to just call on random people. You're like, what? I didn't sign up for that. Let me see.
I noticed you said some people like start with the hardest parts. But I don't know, just as a comment, I like to start with the easiest parts because then at least I've started, which is sometimes the hardest thing. So I guess it depends on how each person works best.
Thank you, Annabelle. That's exactly what I keep meaning to actually change that slide to say start on the hardest or start on the easiest or start wherever, just start. But I agree with you because sometimes just getting that flow going, it allows you want to minimize that entry threshold. Yeah, so thanks for sharing. Is anyone GB? Can I ask you if you've had any experience with focusing on writing or?
I tend to for me, it's kind of like I hit the zone and then I'll suddenly just drift away. Like I'll have like a solid, like an hour and a half where I'm just like in the mood and I'll just write everything out. Like I'll be doing pretty well. And then suddenly I hit a roadblock and I'll check, like you said, I'll check my phone or I'll just get up to make tea and then I'm like, yep, it's gone. So I probably say just, I start off small, but then I just tend to extend it out to see however long that my focus can last up to. So I'm just like,
yeah. So, and that's great too. I mean, I've been in a situation where, if my timer goes off and I still want to write, I'll just continue writing. Because as you say, if you've hit a flow, you kind of want to have that going. But I guess one thing I would like to stress is that if you feel like, especially if you've been able to create and actually put words down, that it's like running a race, right? Stop. It's like practicing for anything. If you get to the point where you're just like, I can't, nothing's happening. Just take a break. Just take a break, because I don't think once again, I'm just going to have this analogy of sports. I don't know how many of you guys do sports, but basically if you were practicing your sprints or whatever, I'm not a runner. I'm sort of mapping onto what theoretically would be the case. You know, if you're having a difficult day doing your sprints or your laps or whatever, I don't think your coach would say, hey, I think you should do that 10 times more, right? The coach would be like, hey, why don't you just take a break, clear your head, you know, have a cup of tea, just try to reset your brain, and such that when you come back, you can be, you know, refreshed. So along those lines, that's the, you know, keep a sense of humor about it, and in particular, if you've already been in a situation what you've been able to produce, and you're feeling like, okay, that's it, that's all I've got for today, that's fine. Do other things, make some figures, fine tune some plots, read some papers, clean up your reference lists. There's always a gazillion things that need to be done when you're writing. All right, so here's some more specific writing tips. This is probably stuff that you maybe are more familiar with. So when writing in general, and this is a stylistic thing, and I think it has changed with time, but I can tell you right now that in terms of papers that I tried to, you know, in terms of reading literature papers, that these are all sort of hallmarks of papers that are enjoyable to read. Try to use an active voice instead of the passive one. My examples are very astronomy related, probably. You probably know why. But the reaction of various metals were tested. So that's what's considered passive voice. And instead you can write, we tested the reaction of various metals. Yeah. I know that sounds kind of very generic, but you can see already the tone is different. Use present tense whenever possible. So for example, we plotted the mean and the error in figure 1. So actually you could say we plot the mean and error in figure 1, because when you're reading a paper, you're referring to something that's actually in the paper, so it's present tense. Now, obviously, if you're referring to measurements that were made in the lab or data that were taken at a telescope, then that's past tense. But in general, you know, in the analysis part, if you're referring to things within the paper, try to keep it present. This is really the takeaway, keep it short and simple. So this is one aspect of scientific writing that I get on my team all the time. I'm like, oh, right. I'm like, okay, so you have this really long paragraph. What are you actually trying to say? And then they'll say it, and I was like, well, then just write that. I don't need all this other stuff. It's just really distracting. And it's tiring, right? Because you want the reader to actually really focus on what it is that you've done. You're not trying to write the next, you know, masterpiece of prose. I mean, you want to write well, because if you write well, then people will enjoy reading your papers and they will actually understand your papers. And presumably also, if you're putting a lab report in, you're going to get marked on it. And so you want the person who's marking your lab reports to understand what you're doing and hopefully enjoy reading your report, because if they're going through a stack of them, or they're, you know, that will definitely sound out in a good way. So just keep it short and simple. And that does take a lot of practice. Try to avoid jargon, especially in the abstract and the introduction. You really want to make this very accessible. And then along the same lines, you're writing to express information. You're not trying to impress the reader. Okay, so the reader is presumably someone who's a scientific colleague. They're not there to be impressive. They're there to understand what it is you did and what it is that you are trying to show. And so essentially, if you have this long expose trying to pull up every single word in the dictionary, that in the end could be expressed in a short, concise, and clear message, go with a short, concise, and clear message. I like this. Put the most important part of the sentence first. In terms of when you're structuring your documents or your paragraphs, remove the excess words as much as possible. So here's an example. In these diagrams, there is a reddening mixing ambiguity in that at any one place in the diagram, there is a range of starburst temperatures, AGN reddening, and a mixing of the two components which can place a galaxy at that position. It's a very long sentence, very convoluted, does not actually make any sense. Versus the version that's shorter, Different starburst temperatures, AGN reading, and the relative ratio of starburst to AGN activity can produce the same line ratios on the optical diagnostic diagrams. Now, I'm sure that neither of those made a lot of sense to because this is a fairly high level astronomy fever, but hopefully you can at least see that first, there's a version that has fewer words, and then second, take it from me, for someone who works in the field, the second shorter version makes a lot more sense than the first one. So always really try to think about how you can make it clear and concise. This is a good one. Avoid demonstratives. Don't use this, that, these, those, because that's all relative. Also, don't use comparatives, because once again, that's all relative. And because we are in physics and astronomy, we are a science, so we use quantitative measurements and we're not qualitative. So you don't use the word this shows that, and a nuclear energy source is more sensitive. More sensitive to what? Relative to what? Right. So think about how you can quantify. So one of my pet peeves is that when someone in my team, and they know this, like once they've worked with me long enough, they know, they'll be like, well, this is more statistically significant. I'm like, what do you mean? What does that mean? Just because you say the word statistically significant doesn't mean anything to me. Tell me, give me a number. Give me either this is 97th percentile, this is 2 sigma versus 5 sigma. So these are all quantitative measurements. This population is twice as likely as this other. Sorry, I'm using this. Population A is twice as likely to have this property compared to population B. So that actually makes some sort of quantitative statement. So don't use these wishy-washy words. They're helpful for expressing maybe in a very general sort of day-to-day language. I mean, you wouldn't want to talk like this to your friends, right? Like you don't necessarily have such quantitative language. But for scientific writing, that's why it's a very different level than just the normal day-to-day discussions. Elements in terms of good paragraphs. So unity, order, coherence, and completeness. So the first sentence of the paragraph, also as a topic sentence, should give the reader a good idea of what's going to be in that paragraph. If you have your paper, your lab report, your scientific document, I should be able to skim basically the first sentence of each paragraph and get a sense of what that document is about. And so the idea is it's like these stepping stones. Also, paragraphs should not be a full page long, especially not for scientific writing. Paragraphs should have one topic sentence, 2 to 3 supporting sentences, and then maybe a closing sentence, and that's it. 4 to 5 sentences max. And so in the same way that none of us likes to read giant blocks of text, I mean, there's a reason why I have this slide here and it's bulleted. Yeah. I mean, I could write it as a paragraph, a really long paragraph about essentially with the topic of, sorry. I seem to, with basically paragraph tips. And then I could essentially just write it as just one giant paragraph, right? But our brains are much better at parsing information that's concise and sort of visually broken up. You can see it just in this slide, in pretty much every single talk you go to. Topic sentence introduces the main idea of the paragraph, supporting details. You really want to be able to develop and support the main idea, and then you have a closing sentence. So these are different types of paragraphs. And obviously, I'm not going to test you on this, but when you're writing, just kind of ask yourself, well, what am I writing in this section? Like in the methodology section, I would definitely be talking about definitions, classifications, and maybe a sequence of how measurements were taken. In a discussion section, I would definitely be having paragraphs that do compare and contrast, and also explain what my measurements were. and also evaluate what the relative strengths and weaknesses of my experiment or my measurements were. Right? So these different types of paragraphs go into different sections of that lab report or that paper. And so you have the introduction, you have your data and methodology, you have usually results, discussion, and then conclusion. Those are essentially the main pillars of any lab write-up and or paper. I think that's pretty familiar, everyone. Yeah, here's the other one. As I said, quantify, please. In general, we are a science, we make measurements. Don't say a number of or some of these or a large number or a few or not that many, right? So these are all very qualitative. You really need to quantify any adjectives. Strong, large, small, weak, faint, luminous, all need quantification. So in terms of what I would consider large, would not be the same as what you would consider large. But how would I know? But if you say that something is a factor of 2 larger, I'll be like, okay, I understand that. I understand what that means now. Okay. Oh, data are plural. I think most people don't really fully appreciate that, but it's plural. That's why we usually say the data are reduced, or those data are taken with. A couple of other things. I know this seems very, very detailed, but it goes along with the idea of writing clearly, which is that if you're going to use while, since, and as, these are all time related. So these are things that if you were doing a time sequence of measurements, then that would be appropriate. But since and because, not the same, right? Since is a causal time thing, whereas because can be due to an action. I think, hopefully most, I never know if I feel like I'm being like a grammar school teacher, or if you guys are all like, yeah, we already know all of this, but I'm just gonna keep going, motoring along for a little bit, and then you can tell me that you already knew all this. We, along the lines of using while, whereas or although, or as and because, and once again, since and because are not the same. So really, you wouldn't use, for those of you who work in these very, very high caliber labs, you would make sure you use the right tool for a particular part of your experiment, right? Say your cooler, your refrigerator for subatomic particles or whatever, or if you're using telescopes or instruments on telescopes that make certain measurements, you would always make sure you're using the right tool to make the measurement. Words should be the same. You need to make sure you use the right words to express what you're trying to say. And so it's important to understand the differences, the nuances between these words, because there is nuance and you can use that to your advantage when you're trying to express what you're doing, which is a very high level and highly technical endeavor. Professional versus conversational. You guys probably already know this. You don't write to see if, you say we test whether, and you don't say we put the, you would say we place the or the, and the plot shows or figure X shows or figure 2 shows, and instead of saying we ran the model, you'd say we calculate the models to determine, etc. And so these are just examples of, on the left hand side, what would be considered conversational language, and on the right hand side, what would be considered professional language, the stuff that you would be using for documents, lab reports, papers, writing thesis, a research thesis, etc. So, read papers to write papers, because you'll know which papers actually you understand, and you'll think, okay, well, why do I understand this paper better than this other paper? And the language, use that as a way to try to learn what those elements are in your particular field that help communicate effectively the ideas that you're trying to express. Okay. And I think that's it, actually. So yeah, I feel like I got super detailed at during the last bit, but I'm going to open it up for questions. if there are any. That was it for my talk so far. Did anyone have any questions or anything you want me to follow up a little bit more?
I had a question in terms of finding your voice in in your writing. Like, what would you say is the best? Because most of the time I seem to struggle with, like, especially with like scientific writing, is like struggling with finding your own voice and kind of putting it across. Not because it either become way too formal. Because I think for papers, it's somewhere in the middle ground where it's like it's not way too formal, but it's like still you have your own voice and it's in the like I don't know, like
yeah, I totally understand. Yeah. So I think that also comes with practice. So the funny thing is, when I went to university, I actually didn't know what I was going to major in. So I'm always interested to know why people decided to go into physics, because honestly, physics was not on my radar. I went to university. I was actually going to study humanities, the arts, and be a creative writing major. It's completely different, right? I mean, when I went to school, I went to secondary school. I actually had everything. I had both the sciences and the arts, and so I was able to get all of that. And that's I didn't really know what because I was interested in everything. And so, but then I took a couple of classes in astronomy and in physics, and I was like, well, actually, this is pretty cool. And so, the reason why I share this both is because it's kind of funny because it's I think most people kind of know early on that they find physics really interesting and they want to do it. And then there's still a handful of us who had no idea until really much later in life that this was where we were going to go. But the other thing is that for me, my voice really is always continuing to evolve. And it's funny because I look at some of the stuff I wrote even 10 years ago, like when I was a student, or actually not even a student, already in my postdoc. And my voice, it's still my voice. I can see myself writing it, but in terms of how clearly I express myself or the style I have, I can see how it's evolved. And so I guess what I'm trying, sort of in this very long-winded response, is to say, don't worry about finding your voice. It's already there, and it's going to change with time. So just write and try to look at what you write in an objective sense and ask, am I communicating what I'm trying to communicate? Is there a way I can express myself more clearly? Is there a way I can try to, if I move this paragraph over here or over here, maybe that will help with the flow. And so paper, and that's what I was trying to say earlier, is that you'll write stuff, and some of the stuff you'll maybe put first in the methodology section, but then as you continue writing, you realize actually it doesn't belong there. It really should go maybe more in the results section, and vice versa. So you kind of move these things around. But the reason why you do that is because that's you finding your voice. Like, how am I expressing this information in a way that's reflective of how I want people to hear me in communicating this information? So I don't know if that made sense, but hopefully a little bit.
Yeah, that helps.
Yeah, I mean, look, in the end, your voice is already there. That's all I have to say. It will change also with time. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. Okay. Is there? Should I open the chat window? I closed my chat window, and I don't know.
Oh yeah, that was a question from Stephen in the chat.
Okay.
I can read it out if you want.
Yeah, that'd be great because I can't find my chat window.
Okay. He says, obviously, grammar and effective writing is an important aspect to writing a coherent paper, but how scrutinized would these things generally be? Minor mistakes in writing punishable by death in the academic world?
Yeah.
That's from Stephen.
So I guess the question I have is, what level are you talking about? So in terms of, let me think about this. So you never write a paper alone. And if it's grammar or those smaller things, that's why having other your co-authors or your collaborators read. Students, no offense, are really good at finding grammatical errors. Like this is like anyone who joins my team, like they're already, as soon as anyone joins the team, they're already looking at papers and in draft form from other members on the teams. They're looking at proposals I'm putting through, and oftentimes they'll be like, I don't know anything about this field. Why are you asking me to look at this? And I'll be like, you will find all of the grammatical errors that I make and I do not see because I've looked at this thing 1,000 times. Like you would not, so having somebody else proofread your paper, a friend, a colleague, etc., they'll find all of that. I think the hardest part is actually having somebody who really goes through and tries to understand everything and asks when they're looking at your paper or reading through a different section, saying, do I actually understand what Stephen is trying to say here? Even if I'm not an expert in that field, does this actually make sense to me as a fellow physicist? I mean, it should, because if it's a paper, it should be written for anyone who has essentially, university level physics. It should be understandable. But by the time, if we're writing a paper for publication, there are many eyes that go over it. So those types of mistakes will not make it through usually to the final version that gets submitted for publication. And even then, you're going to have copy editors go through and try to add commas and stuff. I had a fight with a copy editor because I was like, you added a comma where I do not want a comma. It is not appropriate. So, yeah. So I think the most important thing is just don't worry so much about necessarily grammar and punctuation, except in the sense that you have to use it to your advantage. There are certain words that I always misspell. My collaborator will find them for me, but they will not be happy if they read a paper that is not coherent and doesn't make any sense. So hopefully that kind of helped. Okay, any other questions?
Stephen says that does help, thank you. And I have a quick question. You said that if you write good topic sentences, they should work like stepping stones, so you can read the whole paper. When you read other people's papers, like, does that work? Can you do that?
Oh yeah. So I'm sure you guys know this, but for those of you who may not know this, for most of us who read scientific papers, here's usually, and I would argue that 90% of us do this. This is not just me, honestly. So when I see a paper written by, say, a group or a team around a topic that I'm interested in, I'll read the abstract, obviously. I'll look at the team to see if I'm familiar with their work. I will read the abstract. I will then go through the figures of the paper and see if it actually makes sense. If the figures are shit, no offense, I do not read the paper, because if they can't even be bothered to make the figures compelling and informative, then the writing is going to be terrible, and I will not waste my time. And so my team knows that for scientific papers, I always tell them, it's like, I should know exactly the point of your paper without actually having to read anything. Like, I know that sounds terrible, and obviously that's not going to be the case for everything. If you're doing high energy string theory, I mean, but then that language then really, instead of that is figures, would be the equations, right? So that's the language that you would be reading. So to me, figures, going back to this idea of storyboarding, I mean, a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? There's a reason why, for the most part, when you want to share an experience, you don't type it up and text it to people, you take a picture. And so images are extremely important. And when I say images, I don't mean just images of that you take with your camera. It's in terms of making plots and figures and showing your data in a visually compelling manner. So I guess back to Stephen's question of if it's punishable by death. Well, if your figures aren't any good, I won't read your paper. So that's kind of equivalent, I guess. But yeah, so just think about that in terms of the when you're putting together a paper. And I know we've sort of shifted from, say, lab reports to papers, but I would argue the same principle applies, right? Because in the end, the words are there to help explain, help convey, help understand what you've done. And so you should really use the tools at your disposal. And for that, plotting, making figures, images, etc. I mean, those for me are, I mean, right? If I had to explain to you how to wire up, I don't know, a transformer, like if I was here trying to write it out in words versus actually having a diagram, like which would you prefer? I'm assuming most of you guys would prefer the diagram, not the written explanation. You know? So science is the same. Having said that, the diagram is only as useful as being able to explain what the different symbols are, and then how you connect the transformer to, say, whatever power source and get it to do whatever you need it to do. So the writing is there as a tool as well.
Great, thank you.
Was a lot of information. If you guys want, I'm happy to send you the PDF, or actually post the PDF of the slides somewhere. But I'm also happy if you guys if anyone has any follow-up questions, they can always reach me by email.
Okay, that sounds good.
See, I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Yeah. Well, that's the end of the hour, so we'll wrap up. Thank you so much, Kim-Vy, for running this workshop for us.
Absolutely.
And yeah, do feel free to email any other questions if you guys have more.
Great. Well, thanks a lot for this opportunity, and good luck with your writing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Sure. Bye.
Bye.